There's a somewhat strange feeling debating here because usually Christopher and I tend to be on the same side on most issues. So I think this is the first time we have publicly debated against each other, which is for me a sad occasion, I have to say that very bluntly. Because I think what is taking place in the world is very serious, merits a serious discussion, and I was very sad that Christopher and other former friends were on the wrong side as we saw it. The first point one has to make is pose a question. Did what happened on September the 11th constitute an act of war, or was it an act of terror? It's an important question because the responses flow from how you think and how you analyze that act. Now, as far as I'm concerned, what took place on that awful day was an atrocious act of terror, carried out by essentially a small group of individuals on the orders of a slightly larger organization, maximum 2,000 or 3,000 people. Now, if it was an act of terror, then it becomes an extremely important question as to how a state responds to such an act of terror. In the past, states have not gone to war in response to acts of terror, however appalling these acts may have been. And of course, it would have been difficult to go to war in the case of Tim McVeigh bombing the building in Oklahoma, because you can't go to war against yourself. So you have to make a firm decision on how to respond to it. And the response, in my opinion, should have been a measured response and essentially a police response. Because the aim of this war on terror, as declared in the week after it happened, was to go and get, in the words of the great thinker president who now sits in the White House, Osama bin Laden dead or alive. That was the cowboy rhetoric which emanated from the White House. Dead or alive. Fine. That was the war aim. Donald Rumsfeld went out of his way to assure the Saudi Arabians and the Pakistani High Command in the early week after the war, we are not after the Taliban regime. We are quite prepared to do a deal with a section of the Taliban which is hostile to bin Laden. That's what he said. I'm not saying whether it was right or wrong. That was his assessment. And it's important to know this because of what the aims of the war were, to get bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda leadership. Now, let's leave aside for the moment the tricky question of proof, of evidence, which is what is normally required to get people and bring them before a court of law. Let's accept, for the sake of argument, that the Al-Qaeda leadership carried it out. There have been other acts of terrorism, even on the United States itself, like when the Twin Towers were first hit in the 90s. On that occasion, the FBI collaborated with various elements within the Pakistani intelligence services and captured Ramzi Yousef and brought him here back to trial. In the case of Afghanistan, what they've achieved is a change of regime for which I certainly did not shed any tears. One does not have to defend the Taliban to oppose George W. Bush. That's the confusion which has arisen. And my book rejects the argument that if you're not with us, you're for the terrorists. It's a bogus argument. It's an argument used to drown dissent. It's an argument used to make war without allowing an opposition to exist and without permitting that opposition to voice. Because if you're not with us, you're for the terrorists. Absolute nonsense. One can be neither for George W. Bush and this particular war or the terrorists. That's the position which I defend, and I think that is a position which has to be defended if we're going to move forward from this crisis which has arisen after September the 11th. The United States went to war. If you accept that their main objective was not the overthrow of the Taliban regime, which was a sideshow, a side effect, but the capture of Al-Qaeda, then it has to be said that the wars failed. They haven't captured them. The only person they've captured, Abu Zubaydah, third in command of this organization, was captured in Faisalabad, a sleepy Pakistani town, a few weeks ago by classic police operation, classic police methods picked up by the FBI in collaboration with Pakistani intelligence, and presumably is being brought here to be tried, in which case evidence will have to be presented in a United States court. I think that still is quite an essential requirement. So where is Osama bin Laden? No one knows. Today, the government officially said they have no idea where he is or whether he's dead or alive. Does not speak well for the intelligence which preceded this war. Where is Mullah Omar, his confederate, the one-eyed bearded mullah who led the Taliban and who was also on the list of those to be arrested? Nobody knows. The last heard of, he was seen on a motorbike heading towards the sunset. Not all the surveillance managed to track him down. No one knows where he is. What do we have in Afghanistan today? We have an incredibly unstable regime, which everyone admits is unstable, with different competing factions waiting for the money from the United States to stop coming in, and then they'll make a bid for power. Is it the case, even on a very small scale, that the condition of the citizens of Afghanistan has improved? All the evidence says nothing much has changed. The Taliban have been replaced by another gang. This gang is in power, jockeying for power, waiting to see what's going to happen, taking pot shots at the people who've been imposed on that country by the United States of America. That's basically what is going on. A lot of the Taliban people, and presumably, I presume a lot of the Al-Qaeda people, are now in Pakistan, from where they were funded in the first place. That's where they've gone back, which is a close ally of the United States at this particular moment. These people who are now regrouping under the patronage of their former patrons, some of the members of the intelligence services, are now creating mayhem in Pakistan. They've scored a number of big hits, bombing a church in a very secure diplomatic region in Islamabad and killing people, killing the brother of the interior minister, and killing a very fine journalist from the Wall Street Journal, Danny Pearl. Now, I don't believe, by the way, that any of these actions could have been carried out without the support of at least a section of Pakistani military intelligence. So the point I'm making is that the problem is not over. Now, police operations, by their nature, take a long time. It's the same with individual criminals. It's the same with organized groups of terrorists who behave in this way. And so the problem with using police methods is there are no immediate results. With a war, you can at least pretend that there are immediate results, and if it's a war of retribution, then you go in and kill a few thousand people and honor is satisfied. That is the way big states can think, though they shouldn't. That is the way imperial states often think, that what is key is punishment. Now, in this situation, what we require is careful thought about how this is going to move further. At the moment, with the situation in Palestine being what it is and the war against terror on in full swing, the war against terror, you will notice, does not apply and cannot apply to state terror, as long as the states in question are friendly with the United States of America. Doesn't apply to them. Never has and never will. Basically, what we witness then is what is in the interests of this empire, which is now, for the first time we have in world history, a single empire dominant militarily, dominant politically, dominant economically, under the control of a leadership which believes it has the right to do what it wants without consulting anyone. And they're not wrong, not that consultations would make all that much of a difference, but they do believe this now quite firmly. And one of their key thinkers is currently the proconsul in Kabul, Zalmay Khalilzad, who 10 years ago wrote a little paper which was later published as a book saying that after the collapse of communism we have to think seriously, and our aim should very clearly be not to allow any power to develop which could challenge us and challenge our position as an empire. And basically, it seems to be the case that this view is now increasingly being accepted by the people who lead this country. It is impossible to see what they are doing now without seeing it as the actions of an empire whose first and major interest is to preserve its economic and military strength and power against all challenges. And the war in Iraq, which is currently being plotted and planned, and which has temporarily been delayed by Ariel Sharon's adventures in the occupied lands of Palestine, if you look at the effect that that war could have in the Arab world, and not just in the Arab world, in other parts of the world, it totally makes impossible a real battle to curb individual terrorism on a global scale. And I'll tell you why. You see, the key is not the 2,000 or 3,000 people from Al-Qaeda. That is not the key. These people can be isolated, can be arrested, can be dealt with. What is absolutely central is to stop the flow of young middle-class recruits to their cause, and the bulk of these recruits are not the bearded villagers of Afghanistan, but young professionals in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. That's the heart of this octopus. That's where it gets most of its support from. So you have to then ask yourself, why does it get support there? It's not religion. It's not the fact that these people have got nothing better to do. It is a political reason, and that is what has been going on, both in their own countries, in relation to their own regimes. The Saudi monarchy, defended and protected by every American government from Roosevelt onwards. The regime in Egypt, a moth-eaten dictatorship, protected and defended and subsidized by the United States for many, many years since the victory of Sadat in Egypt. So the links between these regimes and the United States is the first problem. And the continuing sore wounds of Palestine is a very major factor. That the inability of the West and the United States to control its principal relay in that region, which has acted as its most reliable enforcer, the most reliable enforcer of its economic interests in this oil-rich region, to control this state, to bring it to heel. In fact, on the contrary, when Sharon used the war against terrorism to draw the Palestinians into the net, there was no opposition from George Bush or Donald Rumsfeld, or later on, as we discovered, from Colin Powell. The entire leadership backed what he did and then tried to rein him in. And what have taken place in Palestine are atrocities on a grand scale, have no doubt about it. And the Israeli press in this regard, I have to say, has many, many more reports than the Western press, to its credit. When Marif, a middle-of-the-road Israeli newspaper, quotes an Israeli officer as saying, if we are sent by the government to conquer and maintain our control of the occupied lands. This may sound shocking, but we will have no alternative but to repeat the tactics used by Germany in subduing the Warsaw Ghetto. That was said and published in an Israeli newspaper, but it can't be written or published in any newspaper in the land of the free. Why not? When Israeli soldiers, 450 brave Israeli reservists, including captains and majors, say that they are not going to defend Israel beyond the 67 frontiers and borders, is any of them shown on the networks here? A few of them make it on European television. It is, after all, a major event, and a very positive event, if we really want to create peace in that region and end a sort of crude tribal hostility. It's an extremely important event, yet it's kept away. And till this problem is solved, and the only way it can be solved now, all my life I've believed in a binational state in which Jews and Palestinian Arabs could live together. This now seems to be a total utopia and has been one for some years. The only solution here is the emergence and existence of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state, and not shriveled little Bantustans, which is what's been on offer, or three little Bantustans, which was the next offer made by Barak. A proper state, and as part of that deal, there will be a deal on the Golan Heights, and Israel will be recognized. Not that anyone can challenge it militarily, because it has weapons of mass destruction. We know this. Nuclear weapons and chemical weapons. And will use them if anyone tries to push it back. It's not going to happen. But in any event, it will be recognized. So that's the reality which we confront in Palestine, and it's a very important part of stopping the flow of young people to terrorism, because I don't want that to happen. It's crazy politics. But you don't deal with it by waging war, by dropping bombs, by killing people. That doesn't stop it. It's an easy solution. It's not a difficult thing to do. And I think the main reason they did it was to appease the population at home. There couldn't be any other reason for doing it. We're now living in extremely dangerous times, in my opinion. The world is far more dangerous than it was during the days of the Cold War. Because in those days, you had ordered states, whatever you thought of them, and the United States could do lots of things. It could go and wreck the ecology of Vietnam, it could bomb civilians, kill them, it could throw prisoners out of helicopters, it could give the order, take no prisoners, to both its own troops and the South Vietnamese troops fighting for them. But it always knew that there would be no attacks on the US mainland. In a curious way, it was a tribute. They paid a tribute to the enemy, knowing this wouldn't happen. They could carry out a coup d'etat in Chile. Kissinger could attack the Chileans for being irresponsible, for electing Salvador Allende's government. They could put Pinochet in power, kill thousands and thousands of people, and justify them. No Chilean ever came to bomb the United States. They tried to kill Fidel Castro 3 times, tried to topple his government. They've still embargoed him. No Cuban commandos have been sent by Fidel Castro to bomb the United States. So who does it? I'll tell you who does it. The people who do it are the people who've been trained, hired, used, and dumped by the United States themselves during the last decades of the Cold War. Because they used political Islam very consciously as a bulwark against the Cold War enemy. And they used the Saudi regime and Wahhabism to go and penetrate every single Muslim country. This started in the middle of the Cold War. You know, people talk about civilizational conflict. I don't believe in that. I don't believe it exists. Because everything, the whole world was touched by the storms and fires of the 20th century, the Islamic world and every other world. The largest communist party in the world, outside the communist countries, was in Indonesia. 1 million strong members, 1 million sympathizers. Who was back? The army and the Sarakate Islam was back to destroy it. And they did it. 2 million people died, or 1.5 million if you want the lower estimate. What was the largest radical force in the Middle East? The Iraqi Communist Party and the oil workers' trade unions. Who backed the gangster wing of the Ba'ath Party, i.e. Saddam Hussein, and brought them to power? Washington. Who unleashed Saddam Hussein to try and defeat the Iranian clerics? Armed him. Washington and Britain. So the problems have a history. And I know history is not a fashionable discipline these days. But there is a history here. And all these people who've now turned against in this incredibly dramatic fashion, actually Saddam hasn't, he's still too cautious for that, and he's unlikely to. But it is the Islamist groups that were trained, camps in Arizona where Afghanistan and things were stimulated to train them how to use Stinger missiles, how to knock out a Soviet tank. And then these people were dumped. No one would accept them back. And they do what they do. And of course they have to be stopped. The point is, making war in this fashion isn't going to stop it, because the war has now become, it's not a war against terror. This has now become a war to remap the world in the interests of the United States empire. That's basically what's going on. In rational terms, the war against Iraq doesn't make sense from any point of view. Nor does it make any rational sense to keep backing the Israeli regime when anyone with any sense in the administration would know that this is not going to lead anywhere, and that further crushing the Palestinians and humiliating them is going to have further blowbacks. That's why I say that this isn't a war against terror. The concrete effects of this war are to promote terror. That's the reality that we face today. And that is why it is extremely important for dissent in the United States to flourish, because what you do here matters. It always has. There have always been two Americas. Dissent against imperial adventures has existed right from the beginning, with the incredible polemics waged by Mark Twain. And it has existed throughout American history. And this is a very vital, valuable strain in the United States of America. And we need it. We needed it during the Vietnam War. We needed it during the Central American business. We needed it where they were raping Chile. And we still need it. In fact, we need it even more because there is no other countervailing force in the world after the end of the Cold War. There is no other empire jostling competitively with the United States, giving a space in which resistance and dissent can flourish. And so the attempts made after September the 11th to stop debate, to curtail it, which led to large numbers of brown-skinned people in this country being attacked, some being killed, and then patriotism being enforced on them, where people felt that they had to drape themselves in the flag, and they had to put God Save America, or they would be beaten up. That's the reality. And I can disagree with Christopher on many things. But what I think is intolerable is you can defend the empire, Christopher, but don't attack those who are trying to maintain a tradition of dissent in this country. They are weak enough as it is. There are other more important targets.
It's okay to hold your applause, ladies and gentlemen. I haven't started yet. It's not the case, and I don't wish that it was, nor do I regret it, that this is my first disagreement in public with Tariq. I think it may be the first on a podium. I seem to remember a rather piercing argument about the class nature of the Soviet state about 20 years ago, where you were wrong about that too, by the way. But I am willing to say that I'm, in a fraternal spirit, glad to see that Tariq has so much modulated the articles and books and speeches that he was making last year. It seems that he becomes more moderate, more temperate on this point, the more times he comes up against opposition in debate. He now includes criticism of bin Laden, who he invited me to support as a revolutionary last September, in print, in Counterpunch, of Milosevic and Mladic, and even of Saddam Hussein. In fact, he's just given you a whole list of extremely reactionary forces, from the mullahs to Saddam, all sponsored by the worst empire in history, the United States empire, without noticing that he's simultaneously urging you not to struggle against them. I think we can, with a little luck, elucidate this gigantic contradiction in his worldview. And I think before my opponent can be counted as serious, however, he'll have to give us a clearer statement of what he really thinks about the future confrontations. And, to borrow the language of the movement, which gave us both political birth, he may have to make a few self-criticisms of the positions he's already taken. Now, the essential common element in the past remarks and the present remarks that he's made is the concept of moral equivalence. It's inscribed, in fact, on the cover of this book, which has a picture of George Bush wittily represented as a mullah, and in the title, as you can see, which puts the two sides on all fours. And it's pervasive also in all his written and rhetorical work on the subject. If I go only as far as page 1, and I think a moment spent on the question of evidence might not be wasted, comrades and friends. I hope I can say ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. There exists no exact incontrovertible evidence about who ordered the hits on New York and Washington. Well, I don't know what it will take to persuade Tariq or some others about this. Perhaps the Braggart cable TV video transmitted yesterday by Al Jazeera, which has Ayman al-Zawahiri, Mr. bin Laden's lieutenant, and Mr. bin Laden bragging of the events, and has one of the suicide bombers giving us his farewell address with a montage of the World Trade Center blazing behind him, an address I think we can be sure was recorded before September the 11th. Perhaps this is not convincing, but it looks like pretty good circumstantial evidence to me. We may not take everyone's Miranda confession at its face value, but I would say on the question of evidence we're getting closer. And then there's a passage on page 2, which I'm sorry I'm compelled to share with you. The complacency of this world, this is the American imperial world, by the way, not just your world, was severely shaken by the events of 11 September. What took place, a carefully planned terrorist assault on the symbols of US military and economic power, was a breach in the security of the North American mainland, as we've heard. An event neither feared nor imagined by those who devised war games for the Pentagon. That's not quite true. The psychological blow was unprecedented. The subjects of it's italicized, the empire had struck back. Bear this in mind. This was an attack on our country by our subjects. Tariq goes on, I want to ask why so many people in non-Islamic parts of the world were unmoved, and why so many celebrated. In the Nicaraguan capital of Managua, people hugged each other in silence. Might be unwise then to ventriloquize what it was they were going to say, but let's admit this might be true. In Porto Alegre, in the deep south of Brazil, a large concert hall packed with young people erupted in anger when a visiting black jazz musician from New York insisted on beginning his performance with a rendering of God Bless America. The kids replied with chants of Osama, Osama. The concert was cancelled. There were celebrations on the streets of Bolivia. On it goes. None of this is neutral. This is an invitation from people with whom we might be expected to sympathize with their sympathy for the mass murder of American civilians in a gross aggression against American civil society. Now, if these examples count, if the example of kids at rock concerts in southern Brazil count and can be taken as evidence, however anecdotal, then so is what I'm about to tell you evidence. The leader of the main American Nazi party, the National Alliance, announced that day he wished his own cohorts had as much testicular fortitude as the cohorts of Al-Qaeda. In the Czech Republic, the leader and convener of the chauvinist neo-Nazi National Bloc, as it's called, Jan Kopal, addressed a rally where he said bin Laden was an example for all our children. Horst Mahler of the German neo-Nazi party, a former Baader-Meinhof ratbag, announced his solidarity with the murderers, proclaimed that America had got what it deserved. If these anecdotes of Tariq's are evidence, then so are mine. Now, I believe that the amalgam technique, the suggestion of association, is actually a Stalinist technique and should not be employed, but if it can be employed, it can be rebuked in this manner, and it's not perhaps without its indications of what it is that lurks behind this synthetic, pseudo-pretended anti-imperialism. And of course, Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson declared on the same day that a judgment from heaven had fallen upon profane and immoral America. This book bears the publication date 2002. I don't know how its author failed to collect these reflections too in his anthology of response. And I should add, and it would be indecent not to add, that while many Christian fascists and American and white Caucasian neo-Nazis declared their solidarity with Al-Qaeda in its heroic struggle against the Jewish American empire, a large number of Muslim figures, secular and clerical, denounced these same murders in unexpectedly round and unequivocal terms, and that deserves to be borne in mind too, as it is not in the excerpt I just quoted to you. So I ought not to, and I hope I'm not running the risk of, letting my own position be understated or overstated. There has been for some time now, a civil war within Islamic society, within the Islamic world. On one side are those who are content to live within the Muslim world, to have mutual relations with non-Muslim states and minorities and peoples. On the other are those who want Sharia law for Muslims, in other words, Islamic states, not just states for Muslims, and who wish to extend this rule to non-Muslims living within their borders and societies, and even far outside them by the means of jihad. That's a plain fact, known to all, and knowable long before September last. There's no blurring of this distinction. Why do the mullahs of northern Nigeria now demand the stoning of women taken in adultery? Why do they demand the extension of Muslim law to non-Muslim provinces of their suffering country just embarked on its first experiment with civilian rule? Why do murderers in Tunisia crash a truckload of explosives into an ancient synagogue? Why do Malaysian demagogues now seek to claim that a 55% Muslim country should be declared an Islamic state with Islamic law? Why do mobs in Indonesia attempt to eradicate infidel minorities? Is it because they're worried about McDonald's hamburgers, or the fate of the rainforest, or the fate of the Enron pension fund? No, it is not. It's because of the spirit of theocratic and tribal absolutism which is abroad among us again, and has rich and powerful backers among the oligarchs with whom, to our shame, our government shares power. Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia has, in this city, and has for 2 decades had, more power than any 24 senators. The murder victims of New York and Pennsylvania and D.C. were not first gutted with knives like sheep and then burned alive by subjects of our empire. They were slaughtered by the clones and surrogates of a covert part of this empire, paid for by the Saudis, and armed and trained by the Pakistani secret police. And that must be the beginning of any radical critique. And it quite obviously negates Tariq's point that no state terror that has ever been endorsed by the United States will ever be opposed by it. What have we just done but undone the Pakistani occupation of Afghanistan? It's true that the Bush administration doesn't have the fortitude to call this by its right name, but that's what was done. The Pakistani occupation of Afghanistan has been undone by force. And the Saudi network is being rolled up. And this is a confrontation with what you might very well call imperial and fascistic forces, and it's a very good thing that the United States embarked on this war, and for embarking on it, it deserves more support and deserves to be criticized only when it seems to waver in upholding certain values against such forces. Now, we were warned, we were put on notice of this a long time ago, in my opinion. On the 14th of February, Valentine's Day 1989, the Ayatollah Khomeini issued an unprecedented call for the murder of a novelist living in England, who was not a citizen of Iran, for the writing of fiction. He hoped to do this, he hoped to accomplish this, and he offered money for it in his own name, not because he was a stern critic of developments in Western fiction or postmodernism, but because he wanted to put himself at the head of the movement for Islamic absolutism, to show that nobody can outbid him in fanaticism. He wanted to do what bin Laden is now trying to do, to make himself the unassailable leader of the most extreme forces. Now, as it happens, Bush Sr.'s comment on that day, President George Bush I, when asked for a comment, was this. He said, I'm not aware that I am required to give any comment because I don't see that any American interest is affected by this UK's from the Ayatollah. And it was Susan Sontag who has had her share of abuse recently, who in a very sweet way pointed out, she was that year's head of PEN, well, Mr. President, it would be contemptible to say Mr. Rushdie has an American wife who's also been driven into hiding with him, but perhaps it could be said that the United States had some interest of its own in upholding free expression, in allowing novelists to write without the threat of murder suborned with money in the open name of the theocratic head of a foreign state. And gradually, because we didn't give an inch to it, where is Khomeini now? He's a discredited and deceased absolutist. Where are the neoconservatives like Abe Rosenthal and Norman Podhoretz, who said that Salman Rushdie got what was coming to him because he had sympathized with the Palestinians? Where's all the liberal crap that was talked in those years about, well, we must be sensitive to Islamic concerns and multiculturalism? And where's the religious nonsense that was taught by Protestants and Catholics? Cardinal of New York, Chief Rabbi of Israel, Archbishop of Canterbury, all said the problem was blasphemy, profanity, not the open threat of terror against free expression and literature. We had to come a long way through this battle. We should have learned a little from it. And today it's Khomeinism that's exposed as a total failure and humiliation in front of its own people. And it's the Iranian mullahs who have to justify their rule and cannot muster the votes even to win the elections that they stage and then negate. Also in the 1980s, we were warned repeatedly. An attempt was made to destroy Algerian society by an armed fundamentalist revolt. An attempt was made to destroy the Coptic minority in the ancient state of Egypt by transforming Egypt into a Sharia state. Similar movements were launched in Turkey and elsewhere, and all of them were beaten. And they weren't beaten by Western imperialism, comrades, friends, really. Pay attention. They were beaten by the determination of the FLN and of the Berbers and many other secular and civil society forces in Algeria who said, we will not give in to a fascist rebellion that attempts to impose theocracy by force. We will keep shooting as long as they keep coming. My solidarity is with the Front National de Libération of Algeria, as it always has been in that battle, in which the West was effectively neutral, as it was about Egypt and Turkey too. Defeated. It's a matter, therefore, of our solidarity with those in the Islamic world who fight against tyranny and theocracy and the misery and war that it brings with it. And that's going to call on all our intelligence and all our curiosity and all our sympathy and all our internationalism. There may be, and there no doubt are, some stupid ways or self-righteous ways of being in favor of this war or of the Bush foreign policy, as with the Inspector Clouseau moment in Caracas this week. There are many stupid ways of being in favor of this war or this policy, but there is no intelligent way and no principled way of being against it. It's a war that has to be won, cannot be lost. Defeat is in two senses of the word, I think, unthinkable. First, because jihad always fails. All jihads have always failed. They've inflicted terrible costs on their own societies and others. They've ended in mutual cutthroating and fratricide. They've exacted appalling costs, but they have always failed. In other words, there's no chance these people can win or even make a point. The other sense in which defeat is unthinkable, I hope, is evident to everybody. It delights me to say that compromise with it, or euphemism about it, is likewise impossible. Why look for common ground? Why look for understanding with a force of this kind? It has to be and must be opposed unflinchingly. And just look, since Tariq took some time on this, I will too, at what's happened to a cause that many of us hold very dear. The long, arduous struggle of the Palestinian people for self-determination. The Israeli government and police may have been very gravely at fault when in the 1980s in Gaza they began to build up the forces of Hamas against what they thought of as the too red and too secular PLO. I think Israel will never cease to regret the mistake it made in that tactic of divide and rule. But the Saudi money and the Saudi subsidies for suicide murder, not suicide bombing, suicide homicide, the deliberate destruction of civilian life by the destruction of indoctrinated children, the most repulsive tactic that it's possible to imagine being adopted, is not forgiven by that original mistake, any more than bin Laden's activities are forbidden by the fact that once he was a paid mercenary in the war against the Red Army, which had no right in Afghanistan in the first place, by the way. Now, just because Bush doesn't denounce the Saudis for paying for Islamic jihad in Gaza and Hamas on the West Bank does not mean that we must not. It's incumbent upon us to denounce this kind of thing wherever it occurs, and to notice something. Even those of us who hold Palestine very close in our hearts and don't propose to abandon it however tough the circumstances come, bin Ladenism poisons everything it touches. Now, in two articles that he's written, I hope this won't seem solipsistic if I take a moment to reply, Tariq has, I haven't yet replied in print, has slandered and taunted me, not that I mind that much, for referring to this movement of sadism and fanaticism and bigotry and cruelty as fascistic or as fascist. Here, if I can quote it, is his supposed historical refutation of that usage of mine. Pre-war fascism, he says, was based on both mass and corporate support, which they retained till it became obvious that they were going to be defeated. I'm sorry about the grammar, it's not mine. Well, Islamic fascism is based on Saudi finance and supposed mass populist support, and it too will be defeated, whether it recognizes it early or late. It has in common with fascism the following symptoms and characteristics. First, it teaches the embittered and the ill-educated that nothing is their fault. Second, it projects the hatred of the embittered and the ill-educated. It projects their hatred and their resentment onto vulnerable or imagined targets, exclusively civilian. Third, it preaches a fundamental anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Fourth, it relies on elite death squads and killing units. Fifth, it is for sale to high bidders. Sixth, it declares war on all art, all culture, and all literature, fusing state power with cult power and religious power to eradicate knowledge and science and beauty. If you ever wonder what these people have in mind for you, just look what they did to the architecture and the museums and the people of Afghanistan. Seventh, it can only maintain momentum by the continuous export of violence. And eighth, it proposes a society run by the precepts of one mediocre book. And that society would be totalitarian in the strict, literal sense that everything not forbidden is compulsory, and everything not compulsory is absolutely forbidden. I rest my case there on fascism. Now, with an assault like that, there isn't a lot of choice except to resist and to defy and to fight back. Now, Tariq Ali spent the months of September and October in London mobilizing for a demonstration with others under the pathetic slogan, "Stop the war before it starts." That's in October and November. Not only is that the most lame, abject slogan I think any peace movement has ever come up with, but it also makes very clear the view of its organizers, which was, and is obviously this, that the war hadn't started yet, which in turn means war did not start on September the 11th. There would only be a war if there was a counterattack. I swear to you, Tariq, I look at you and tell you this, I never thought I would live to see the left sink that fucking low. But this argument, if you knew how you sounded when you did that, ladies and gentlemen, you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't do it. You sound like you think when you do that, okay? But this argument is more also, I'll close, I think I may be trespassing on my time and perhaps your patience. It's about some more elective interventions, things that are not necessarily forced upon us in a struggle for survival or dignity, choices we might make about how to be internationalists, about how to pick sides and how to make interventions elsewhere in the world. So let's review some of the recent cases. A few years ago, so far from stressing Muslim grievances whenever they opened their mouths, Tariq Ali and Noam Chomsky were exerting every sinew to prevent a single shot being fired against Slobodan Milosevic, who was then engaged in a campaign to erase Muslim presence, culture, and people in Bosnia-Herzegovina and in Kosovo. No mention then of Muslim complaints and how necessary it was to take account of them. That was more like National Socialism, by the way, than fascism. Stalinism, combined not for the first time with ethnic cleansing. The entire effort of Tariq and his friends was devoted to preventing any counterstroke to that. The whole anti-war left was committed at best to neutrality in that historic battle. If they had won that argument, the Muslim and secular parts of the Balkans would now be a howling wilderness. If they'd won the argument about Iraq, there would not now be an embryonic Kurdish state in the north of Mesopotamia, growing steadily and beginning to flourish under an umbrella of international protection, and furnishing a good example, not just for last year's Afghanistan, but I hope, and we have much to argue about, perhaps for next year's Iraq, if we're vigilant too. I'm old enough to remember that Kurdistan is a much older cause of the left in the Middle East, even than Palestine. But a creepy silence falls when I ask my former comrades about this example. It can't be right, can it, that Kurds benefit from American and European military guarantees? It can't be right. It doesn't compute to some minds who are not yet prepared for it. But I think if you run into someone who only mentions Serbian and Christian Orthodox grievances when Muslims are being massacred, and who only mentions Muslim grievances when Muslims are the aggressors and the murderers, and who keeps weirdly silent about Kurdistan and Rwanda and Sierra Leone, you may have encountered someone who is suffering, or may be suffering, not from a principled anti-imperialism, but from something quite different, which is a pathological anti-Americanism. Now, the United States, I think I don't need to instruct you, ladies and gentlemen, comrades of this audience in these elementary points, but I'll close by simply saying this. The United States is not the ideal exemplar of the things that we are charged to guard, forced to guard, don't have the right not to guard against religious barbarians and religious fascists. The United States does not embody secular values. It doesn't embody the full emancipation of all minorities, or the full equality of all confessions, or the untrammeled spirit of free and scientific inquiry. It doesn't yet, or at all, embody these, and nor is it yet a democratic republic in a free and equal community of similar states. But it does contain the seeds of this actualization, and so do we. So to place it on, or ourselves, on a basis of moral equality, with medieval and theocratic and fascistic delusions, is unserious, and it is indecent. And by saying that, I don't propose at all to end this argument, but just to clear away some of the intellectual clutter that has to be removed before we can even begin it. Thank you.
Intellectual clutter. Okay, let's take it in turn. Systematically. In the prologue to the book, what I wanted to stress was that the events of September had supporters in large parts of the world and not just the Islamic world. In fact, there were fewer in some of the Islamic countries than there were elsewhere. Christopher didn't read out the reference to a country he knows very well, Greece. Yeah, you could as well. Yeah. 72% of the population actually in favor of the wretched hits, Christopher. So much so that the government had to suppress the opinion polls for not embarrassing the United States. You know, when you say this, it's not to justify it, it's to understand it and explain it so it bloody stops. That's the reason for saying it. It's not to run away from it. The slanders, never written about the Kurds, wrote about the Kurds only several weeks ago, pointing out the different positions that exist within the empire on the Kurds. In Iraq, they are freedom fighters. In Turkey, they are terrorists. And you helped to capture one of their leaders, awful though he is. My position on Kurdistan has been very simple. If the Kurds want an independent state, they should get it across the region. I've never denied that. But there is a difference between an independent state and being a United States protectorate. This is what I was discussing with Kurds in Turkey a few weeks ago. Do you want to be independent, or do you want to be a US protectorate? For Christopher, both are one and the same thing now, as he refers to the United States as we. What we do. And Milosevic, you see, Christopher has this simplistic view that in every war you have to take sides. I don't believe that. And there has been a long tradition, Christopher, in the movement, so to speak, that you don't have to take sides in a war. And one didn't, classically, during the First World War, in the war between the different empires, fighting for colonies and more land and more oppression. One didn't take a position on that. I opposed the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan without supporting the Mujahideen. You want to talk about jihads? The first bloody jihad of the 20th century was organized by Brzezinski, who used that exact word when he armed the bearded men to go back and rebuild your mosques, and God is on your side. There's a stupid photograph of him wearing a turban on the Pak Afghan frontier. So they did wage a jihad. They did use that word, like the British Empire had done before them. The struggle against Milosevic, a popular struggle by the Serbs, yes, obviously. Bombing by the United States, no. For what? The whole thing about that war, which most people acknowledge, is that when he was prepared to pull out without a war and give Western troops Kosovo, Madeleine Albright arrived and put in 2 new clauses which made it unacceptable, because she said, unless you accept that, she said to the Kosovans, we can't bomb. So let's not pretend that this was a great war of liberation waged by the American empire in the interests of Christopher Hitchens. It certainly wasn't. The Salman Rushdie affair and the mullahs? Yeah, I agree with you. What's the big deal? Most people defended him that I know, and I'm probably one of the few people who actually debated the mullahs to defend him, so that they were saying, we'll snip off your tongue as well. But the question about Iran is an interesting one. It wasn't Western intervention. It wasn't bomber jets sanctioned by our humanitarian warmongers which went and got rid of Khomeini. It was biology. He died. And after he died, it opened up conflicts in that society. And it was the Iranians who voted, without the help of American bomber jets, to go and vote out the hardline clerics. And if there's one Muslim country where I feel optimistic about having a reformation, it's Iran. Because 75% of that country is under 35 years of age and 60% is under 25 years of age. And these are people who've just grown up under the clerics. For them, even stories about the Shah are now fairy tales. And these are people who've defied the religious police. And they've marched arm in arm to celebrate pagan festivals and taunted the clerics. These are the people who bring it down, and that's what I support. Because if you don't encourage an organic overthrow of these dictatorships, whether it's Milosevic or Saddam or Khomeini or whoever, you actually create a bigger mess than you intend to sort out, which is exactly what will happen in Afghanistan and is happening in Afghanistan even as we speak. So it's not a question of being soft on these regimes. It's a question of having, yes, Christopher, a principled, intelligent politics, and not to cave into the empire at a time when that empire needs to be opposed simply because you're under pressure. The cab drivers in New York had no option. They told me. They said we had to do it because we were being beaten up. No one was beating you up, to my knowledge. You did it voluntarily, and that's what's annoying. And I'm glad to hear that you've now come out, which I thought you might, and say that you were wrong on the Gulf War, which you opposed at the time. You opposed the Gulf War waged by Bush Sr. I was surprised then, because, normally I know you tend to back these wars in a very principled and intelligent way. You backed the Falklands War together with Mrs. Thatcher and General Pinochet. That was very principled and intelligent of you. You, of course, backed the wars in Bosnia and Kosovo. Backed? Who else was fighting in these wars? Should we remember or forget, Christopher? Al-Qaeda was fighting shoulder to shoulder with you in that particular war. Oh, yes, they were, and 2 of their cadres have recently been deported from Bosnia by the United States, and when the Bosnian government didn't want to give them, because they had fought for the liberation, so-called, of Bosnia, they were told, if you don't give them, your aid will stop. So you were fighting side by side with these people. That was very principled and intelligent of you as well. Algeria. What has happened in Algeria is one of the biggest disasters in the Arab world. But let's not forget how it happened. You were good in what you said about how Mossad helped to create Hamas. I agree with you on that. The creation of the FIS was organized by the most right-wing statist wing of the FLN in league with the French Foreign Office, precisely to do exactly what had been done in Palestine and defeat the more radical wing of the FLN. That was the big faction fight going on. So they created this wretched organization, then they permitted an election. Halfway through the election, which this new opposition was about to win, they stopped the election. The reason they stopped it is because they thought that the Islamic Salvation Front would win, which it would have. But a much better way of dealing with it, instead of repressing it, would have been to say, if you tamper with the Constitution and the rights it gives each citizen, especially the women of Algeria, then we will intervene. If the army had actually said that publicly, there would have been massive pressure. All the people who write about this and know the subject well say that the FIS would have split, because there are 2 currents even within political Islam. There is a hardline current. Not even all of that is for bin Ladenism, as you call it. But there is another current, which is no different, in my opinion, from Christian democracy in Italy or Germany. Religious groups, or no different from large chunks of the Republican Party in this country, where born-again Christianity is quite powerful. As you know full well, the president is one, his attorney general is one. America is saturated with religion. 90% of the people say that they believe in the deity. 60% say they believe in angels. I wish it was the other way around, but the angels are somehow less oppressive, you feel, even in mythology. But that's the reality in which we live. My position is simple. I am for encouraging. The left never used to have a position. There's been a coup in Chile. Maybe the Cubans should go and land troops. There's been a bloodbath in Indonesia. Maybe the Chinese should intervene. When did we ever call on foreign powers to intervene to stop this? We didn't do it because we used to, in those days, rely on the strength of the people to do it. That's why. And as for this fascist argument, do give it a break, Christopher. I'll tell you why. Every time the West has gone to war, every time over the last 50 years, this argument has come up. When Anthony Eden invaded Nasser in 1956 with the backing of the French and the Israelis, what did Eden say in his big address? There is a Hitler on the Nile. Hitler had just been defeated, for God's sake, a few years previously. So there was a Hitler on the Nile. When they went for Iraq during the Gulf War, there was a Hitler on the Euphrates. When they went for Milosevic in Yugoslavia, there was a Hitler on the Danube. Now there's Fukuyama's invention, backed by yourself, Islamofascism. I mean, do have some historical sense. When fascism came into existence and was helped into existence by big capital in Europe, it was for a specific purpose. It's a very specific ideology, largely brought in to crush a threat from the left. That's why it was backed by most of the West. Churchill loved Mussolini, as you probably know. The American ambassador to Italy wrote a glowing introduction to Mussolini's autobiography, saying he's one of the greatest living human beings in the world. Hitler, when he first came to power, was backed by large sections of the rulers of Europe and had a lot of friends in this country. And the reason for that, in Churchill's immortal words, were because this is the only way to block the bestial passions of Leninism. So they even were happy to work with that till the German Empire went out of control and became totally irrational. And then Churchill felt the British Empire was threatened and had to be defended. But even then there was a very big fight within the British ruling class over this. So it's not an ordinary thing to use this word. And it doesn't help. You can say they're nasty, unpleasant, totalitarian, what? Why bring in this word? The only reason it's brought in is because it's the one war everyone knows. Lots of movies have been made about it. Documentaries go on endlessly. More books are written on the Third Reich than anyone else. It's actually to debase the anti-fascist struggle which was fought in Europe, to say that fascism is triumphant everywhere, or everywhere where the West wants to fight, but nowhere where it's backing people who are equally evil. So if we are talking about intelligent and principled debate, I don't intend to learn any lessons from you.
Appreciate it. Nor will you have to, ladies and gentlemen, because I really think that I don't want to stand between you and your turn. I'm sure there are enough clones here to ask me the same questions in different ways. Let me not repeat myself. Let's get on with it. I forego my right of reply. Oh, you're disappointed? Let's hear from them. Come on, bring it on, bring it on.
Okay, again, I ask people please to be succinct, polite, or at least civil. If you, of course, want both people to respond, say that. If just one, say that as well. Thank you. And you may say your name or not. It's up to you.
Is this on? Is it on?
Oh, you have to turn it on.
I did turn it on. Is it on? I have a. My name is Ashraf Ismail. I'm a faculty member here in the government department at Georgetown. I have one question for Mr. Ali, and I have a comment for Mr. Hitchens. Mr. Ali, given that you have made clear the fact that the United States trained and financed Muslim militants in the 1980s, and that they transformed the ISI from a small branch of the Pakistani military into the monster that it has become. And not only that, but the Washington Post reported that the U.S. in fact paid and financed and wrote books glorifying violence for the sake of religion and implanted them in Afghani society. And once they left, after the end of the Soviet occupation, the books stayed. Given the fact that the U.S. has done all of this, and given the fact that it is now waging this war that is not a war, what do you think will be the global unintended consequences of the current campaign, since we know about the unintended consequences of the last glorious triumph? And now my comment for Mr. Hitchens. Mr. Hitchens, I fully accept your right to say whatever you want. However, I do not understand your need. You're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome. However, I can give you a few pointers on giving speeches after the debate if you would like. What I don't understand, however...
Like I said, bring it on.
Sure. Don't worry, it's coming. What I don't understand is your need to insult 1.2 billion Muslims all over the world by slandering the Quran. I simply don't understand that. Sure. But however, I would agree with you, sir, that there is no moral equivalence between the U.S. government and Al-Qaeda. The U.S. government has killed at least 1,000 times more innocent civilians since the end of World War II outside of its borders than Al-Qaeda. In Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, and in Latin America. And lastly, sir, if you can come up with the idea of Islamofascism, then I would characterize the U.S. response to that as liberal totalitarianism, which is the U.S. going around the world and telling societies that share different values, accept our way of life, accept our policies, or else. Thank you very much.
We have a slight difference of opinion as to whether that's a challenge to either of us. I think Tariq may feel that it's only an incitement to him to say all that he just said again. But since I was directly challenged, I feel I'm obliged to reply. I neither know nor care whether however many Muslims you claim there are offended or not by my views of religion. I maintain that there is no such thing as revealed religion, that the holy books are man-made, that so are all the religions man-made. They're open to the same criticism from any human being. The fetishization of them is stupid. And I will add that if that stuff, I've read that book, though it's apparently only supposed to be read in Arabic, which is kind of odd. God only speaks in Arabic. The translations are profane. But I have read the Marmaduke Pickthall translation, which is said by believers to be an adequate, if not beautiful, translation into English. All I can say, if that's the word of God, it was a very bad day for him. I think that will do, except to say that I think the same about the Talmud, the Torah, the Pentateuch, and both testaments of the alleged Christian Bible. Alas, we're not going to be that lucky.